Yes, that would be helpful. All right, well, we finished 2 Samuel last Thursday. And today we're going to begin 1 Kings. That seemed like a logical choice to move to next. And, well, I guess, again, like we do with all books of the Bible, just say a few things by way of introduction to the book. I have Mark is going around passing out the packets for 1 Kings. I feel like these packets are kind of incomplete, personally, and this is, I guess, my attempt to get things together. But there's some things I wish I had been able to include, and I'm still not happy with where they're at, like an outline of the book, for instance. I have a general idea of where we're going with that, but a much more detailed outline is still forthcoming. And also it occurs to me I should have created a parallel, because the book of 1 Kings is parallel to another book of the Bible. Anybody know what it is? There's a lot of parallel passages with Chronicles. Yeah, particularly 1 and 2 Kings basically follow the same track as 2 Chronicles. Although there are numerous differences and there are numerous things that one includes and the other leaves out. Now the book of 1 Kings, like several other books that we've studied, was originally not a book by itself. It was originally combined with 2 Kings. And in the Hebrews had a book just they called Kings. And so you had 1 and 2 Kings were one book. And the reason we have 1 and 2 Kings is because, well, it wouldn't all fit on the scroll, basically, when you boil it down. It's pretty lengthy. It's actually a very long book when you combine them together, some 47 chapters. But there's something we need to realize about this. When you get to the end of 1 Kings, 1 Kings ends by telling you about how Ahaziah became king. And 2 Kings begins by telling you about stuff that happened during Ahaziah's reign. Which looks a little awkward because you're looking at that going, that doesn't look like the book should have ended there. It looks like it should have continued in reading into it. You know, we talk about chapter divisions quite a bit, and it's kind of a running joke that I am always pointing out bad chapter divisions in the English Bible. Here we have an example of a bad book division because the story doesn't really terminate with 1 Kings 22 verse 53. It continues into 2 Kings. Now that being said, this is a workbook on 1 Kings. We're only going to be able to cover 1 Kings in this quarter because of all the time we have allotted. We'll cover 2 Kings in another quarter. In a nutshell, how many of you have read Kings before? Let's just ask that question. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay, so we've read it. How many of you have ever had a Bible class on Kings before? Okay, well, now I'm seeing a lot fewer hands. All right, well, I mean, now more generically, sometimes people will have Bible classes on the divided kingdom. Has anyone ever had that? No. Maybe. Okay, yeah, that's sometimes done as well. And what that is similar to how we do Life of Christ studies, where we combine the Gospels together and kind of go through all of the events. Sometimes there's a divided kingdom study where we combine Kings and Chronicles and go through all of the events in parallel, in tandem with each other. I think there's some benefit to a study like that. That's not how we're going to be doing it in this class, but we will occasionally be making reference to Chronicles as it is relevant. But our primary focus will be on Kings as a book and to see what God was trying to reveal to us in this particular context. Alright, so many of you have read Kings, but it doesn't look like many of you have had a class on Kings before. So, somebody, I won't say his name, but somebody was sticking markers together up here. I have to have a talk with my son later. What would you say, in a nutshell, the book of Kings is about? Now, just shout out what you think. The kings of Israel. Really? Okay, and why? Let's ask a question. Why do we single out Israel? Now, by Israel, do you mean the whole nation, or do you mean the northern 10 tribes? The whole nation. All right. Now, when we read Chronicles, what is Chronicles more focused on? The Chronicles is more focused on the kings of Judah. The kings of northern Israel aren't really talked about very much in Chronicles, except when something they do directly intersects with the king of Judah. Chronicles is all about the kings of Judah. Kings is about the kings of Israel and Judah. Now, out of those two, which one does Kings place more emphasis on? Which one do they devote more space to? Jen? Well, yeah, Judah gets more attention at the end because they last longer. But at the places where they coexist, Israel, northern Israel, actually gets more attention. And more particularly, not the kings, but the prophets who were speaking in Israel at that time. And there's two major prophetic figures at the center of the book. And anybody know who they are? Elijah and Elisha. And these are questions kind of about all of 1st and 2nd Kings together. Now, let's kind of just an outline of what we're doing. And I didn't include this in the packet. The first 11 chapters of King, what would the first section of this book about? What is it really about? Somebody say it? Yes? The first 11 chapters are not about how the kingdom divided, although there are some events in there that precursors lead up to it. But who's the main character, besides God, who is the main character in these first 11 chapters? Main human character.
With David at the very end of his life,
Right. Now, the main focus in these first 11 chapters is on the reign of Solomon. And the first 2 chapters are about how Solomon becomes king, and then the rest of it talks about his reign in detail, some of the good things he does, some of the not so good things he does. We'll deal with Solomon in a little bit. All right. Now, in chapter 12, the kingdom divides. And I'm going to mark this off. Chapters 12 through 16. Through 16 is about this divided kingdom, or the beginning of what we would call the divided kingdom. And what's going on here is it's a series of kings of Israel and Judah, and well, let's see how well we know this. All right, the kings of Israel. How would you characterize them? What kind of men were they? When I say Israel, I'm talking about the northern 10 tribes. When I say Judah, I'm talking about the southern kingdom of Judah. Because that's how the book of Kings shorthand refers to them most of the time. When we talk about the kings of northern Israel, what kind of men were they? They weren't very nice. What were they doing? Huh? Yeah, they were evil kings. How many good kings? Let's just get this out of the way now. How many good kings ruled in northern Israel? Yeah? Zero. There were no good kings in northern Israel. Every single one of them is said to have done evil in the sight of the Lord. I think maybe, hold on, let me check something. I actually included a handout in here. My copy got all streaked, but there's this Kings of Israel reference guide in your packet, and they are all said to have done evil in the sight of the Lord. With one exception, Shallum, nothing said about him. He only ruled for a month, so I guess he wasn't around long enough to do anything. Well, compare that with Zimri, who he only reigned 7 days, and he still managed to figure out how to do evil in the sight of the Lord. I mean, it was only a week, man. How much trouble could you get into? But yes, the kings of Israel are all evaluated negatively. And in fact, there's this repeated cycle where a king will do something bad, the prophet will show up and say, "You've been so bad, the Lord is going to destroy your descendant and your family and replace you with somebody else." So that happens with Jeroboam. Jeroboam dies a natural death. His son Nadab comes along and is killed by Baasha, who then kills everybody in Jeroboam's family. And you think, okay, well maybe things will be good now. Except they're not, because Baasha, after killing off Jeroboam, proceeds to do exactly the same things that Jeroboam did. By the way, what was Jeroboam's great sin? Idolatry. He set up golden calves at Bethel and Dan, and he changed everything about the worship of the Lord. He changed the object of worship, he changed the time of worship, he changed the place of worship, he changed the people of worship. And no other historical figure casts as big a shadow on Israel's history. Every single king after him is compared to him. He continued to walk in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. How would you like that on your tombstone? Because that's what Jeroboam got. He made Israel to sin. He had such a huge legacy. He probably had a bigger influence on his immediate successors than David. He had a bigger influence on people who weren't his immediate successors. And most of the people on this list aren't even related to him physically. And yet the legacy of Jeroboam is what we see throughout these chapters 12 through 16. Jenna, you have something? I basically said it. All right. Now, the third part of the book, and I'm kind of segmenting this off here. This is where it kind of goes over. 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 10. This is a very difficult time in Israel's history. This was what I will refer to as the Omride dynasty. Now we don't know, the Bible doesn't say so much about Omri as it does about his son. And what was his son's name? Ahab, right. Ahab, and wasn't just a bad king. It says that he did more evil than all before him. It says that about his father Omri, who gets a few verses, and it says that about Ahab as well. Anybody know what Ahab... Ahab and Omri are both mentioned quite a bit in secular history. They appear in a lot of inscriptions and things like that. And the interesting thing about Omri and Ahab is that they are widely regarded as some of the most powerful kings to rule in northern Israel. In fact, Ahab was responsible partly for an anti-Assyrian coalition that defeated the Assyrians at the Battle of Karkar. They beat them back because he formed an alliance of Judah, Syria, and Israel, and they banded together and they beat the Assyrians, which was even then a very powerful nation. I believe Shalmaneser III was ruling at the time. And they beat them back at the Battle of Karkar. They had extensive building projects that rivaled those of Solomon. Now I'm saying all this because you're not going to read it in the Bible. The Bible doesn't care about that. The Bible doesn't care about their building projects. It doesn't care about their military exploits. It only cares about one thing. They did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all before them. What does that say about the priorities that we should have? What does that say about the criteria we should use when evaluating our leaders? It's not about what they accomplish in an economic standpoint or a political standpoint or a military standpoint. It's about what they accomplish in terms of doing good or evil in the sight of the Lord that matters. Now, in the time of the Omride dynasty, there's one other thing where Israel goes even further into depravity than they were before. Why was Ahab's reign worse than what we saw with Jeroboam and his lackeys? Did it have something to do with his wife? Maybe. What did his wife do? Yeah, go ahead. There's a few. Right. Yeah. There's a huge bucket list of stuff that Ahab and Jezebel do wrong, and we can get into a lot of detail. Jen, you have something? I'm sorry? Baal. What about Baal? Who was Baal? He was an idol. He was the god of the Sidonians, wasn't he? Yes. Don? Right. See, here's the thing. When the divided kingdom starts, we talk about idolatry. Jeroboam sets up golden calves at Bethel and Dan. What did they call those golden calves? Who did they claim to be worshiping? They still claim to be worshiping Yahweh, the true God, even though the Lord was greatly displeased with the way they were worshiping Him. But with Omri in the picture, and with Ahab in the picture, now Yahweh is kind of nudged off to the side. We're going to make Baal the new god of this realm. They built the city of Samaria, they installed the temple of Baal in Samaria, and they worship Baal. And that's the reason when Elijah comes into this picture and creates this whole challenge of the prophets on Mount Carmel in chapter 18. Whoever's God answers by fire, he is the true God. And Baal worship is still going on. In fact, it persists. And the reason I've taken the story all the way to 2 Kings 10 is that even after Ahab dies, his descendants continue this kind of behavior. And it isn't until they anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi, and Jehu comes in, he kills off every surviving member of Ahab's family, including Jezebel, and then he goes into the city of Samaria, and he has all of the Baal worshippers killed. He has all of the Baal priests killed. He tears down the temple of Baal and turns it into basically a latrine. And then Baal worship is eradicated from Israel. But this right here, in the middle of the story, is one of the darkest times in northern Israel's history, when until Jehu comes and puts a stop to it. Now, Jehu's kind of, the high and mighty hero of the story for a little bit. And there's just this little hope on the part of the reader, because the text doesn't evaluate him until the very end of 2 Kings 10. Just this little hope that, maybe Jehu's going to get things back on the right track. Does he? He doesn't. What happens? What happened? What does Jehu do? After he completely eradicates Baal worship, and the Lord even commends him for that, what's Jehu do next? Well, yes, that was a trick. Jehu did that in 2 Kings 10. He claims, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. And he uses this as a ploy to get all of the Baal worshippers together. He gets them all gathered in the house. He says, I want to make sure there's no worshippers of Yahweh here, only worshippers of Baal. And once they've confirmed that, he says, good, now I kill everybody in this house. That's how he eradicates Baal worship from Israel. He feigned loyalty to Baal to get everybody to come together. But, skip down. Verse 28, thus Jehu eradicated Baal out of all Israel. However, verse 29, as for the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart, even the golden calves that were at Bethel and were at Dan. So after all this, we're still stuck on the legacy of Jeroboam. We're still stuck on worshiping these golden calves. Jehu won't give them up. He won't stop. And so here's what the Lord says. The Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel sin. So, Jehu stopped Baal. He got it half right, but he didn't stop idolatry. And because of that, well, you can see on the chart here, Jehu's dynasty was the longest lasting in the northern kingdom. But even his came to an end because every single one of his sons did evil in the sight of the Lord. All right. And after Jehu's dynasty fell, that was pretty much the end. There were a few other kings who fought and killed each other. But effectively what we have here is the divided kingdom all over again. The legacy of Jeroboam all over again. And when we get to chapter 17, the Assyrians show up. They depose the last king. They remove him. He's killed. They carry the nation off into captivity. The Assyrians had a strategy of whenever they would conquer a nation, they would take their peoples and they would, sort of disperse them amongst other populations as a way of destroying their national identity and exercising dominance over them. They were quite cruel to their captives. 2 Kings 17 has a lengthy commentary on why Israel was sold into captivity. And why was it? What's the big reason for northern Israel's failure? Sin. Idolatry. They kept, he sent prophet after prophet to them and they would not repent. That is the legacy of Jeroboam right there. This There's a couple of other interesting features that kind of connect these sections together. Both of them are characterized by mass murder between kings, with one king succeeding another. Both of them are characterized by conflict between Israel and Judah. During the Omride dynasty, there was peace between Israel and Judah. Ahab made a marriage alliance with Jehoshaphat by marrying his daughter Athaliah to Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram. There's a whole bunch of ugly stuff that happens during that too. And in fact, what almost winds up happening as a result of that is the eradication of the Davidic line. By the providence of God, they survive. But, Jehoshaphat is one of those kings who, on the one hand, he does good in the sight of the Lord, but on the other hand, well, he makes too many friends with the wicked ones. He's just a little too buddy-buddy with the most wicked of all kings in Israel's history. All right, and the rest of Kings, we'll say 2 Kings 18 through 25, we're back to a single kingdom. And, you only have one kingdom at the first part, you only have one kingdom at the end. It's a giant chiasm is what it is. Now there's several other links between these two sections too. What happens to Judah now? And we haven't talked about Judah throughout much of the story. They kind of float in the background throughout much of the narrative of the divided kingdom. They're mentioned. How would you characterize Judah's kings? There were some good kings. There were some bad kings. Which one did they have more of? They had more bad kings than they had good kings. Yes, they had 8 good kings and they had 12 bad kings. I think that's right. Anyway, they also had a queen who doesn't even get an explanation. I mean, it's assumed that she did evil, although the text doesn't have the same formulas in place for her. She was an usurper who ruled for 6 years. That was Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab. Yeah, that's probably a problem too, yeah. But out of all the kings of Judah, the only ones that were good were Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, or sometimes he's called Azariah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. And one other thing that you're going to have to reckon with as we go through this is that sometimes kings have alternate spellings to their names, and that can get a little confusing sometimes. For example, there's a Joram, but sometimes he's called Jehoram. They're the same person. But the problem is, and it gets worse, there's another Jehoram, and there's another who's also called Joram. So there's 2 guys with the same set of names ruling at very similar times in Israel's history. One's ruling in northern Israel, and the other one is ruling in southern Judah. It gets worse. The Jehoram in Judah has a son named Ahaziah. The Joram in Israel had a brother named Ahaziah who also ruled before he did. So you can see why it starts to get a little bamboozling. And then you get into Jehu's dynasty. One of the kings of Judah is a guy named Joash, sometimes called Jehoash. Jehu's grandson is also named Joash or Jehoash. So and you can see this by comparing the charts. I also have here a chart for synchronization so that you can have a little more of a to-scale view about who's ruling co-synchronous with who. Now, there are some difficulties in producing a chart like this because sometimes the numbers in the Bible will give us a little headache. Sometimes there's an implied co-regency. Sometimes they just don't count. The kingdom of Israel wouldn't count years the same way the kingdom of Judah would. So you gotta watch out for things like alternate names, and you got to watch out for things like co-regencies and other stuff like that. It's hard to produce a chronology of the kings. And I'm admittedly kind of piggybacking on the efforts of others. Okay, now all that said, we go through the history of Judah's kings. Even Judah's good kings are frequently good with some qualification to them. Like Asa, for instance. Did good in the sight of the Lord in that he, maintained the temple worship. But, he made an alliance with Aram. He didn't trust in the Lord when he was diseased in his feet. Jehoshaphat. Well, Jehoshaphat did good in the sight of the Lord, but he made an alliance with wicked King Ahab. Joash did good in the sight of the Lord as long as his mentor Jehoiada the high priest was alive. Amaziah did good in the sight of the Lord, but not with a whole heart. Uzziah did good in the sight of the Lord, but he went into the temple to burn incense and got leprosy. There's really only two kings that get a sort of above and beyond evaluation in 1st and 2nd Kings. And who are they? Oh, no. Asa, not Asa. There are two kings of whom this statement is made. He was better in the sight of the Lord than all who came before him and all who were after him. That's said of Josiah. Who's it also said of? Said of one other king. Josiah and... You can look at the chart and cheat too if you want. Did right more than all others. Josiah and Hezekiah, yes. All right, now now there's a lot of discussion about why kings are evaluated the way they are. The one unifying feature about what makes a king do evil or good in the sight of the Lord is how he treats the temple. That's the one unifying feature throughout the whole book that ties it all together. Now sometimes a king treats the temple right, but he does some other bad stuff too. Which also explains why no king of Israel is ever evaluated well, because not one of them ever went to the temple to worship. They set up false sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan and worshipped golden calves in violation of Deuteronomy 12, as well as a number of other passages. Whereas you look at Judah, you look at guys like Manasseh. Manasseh set up idols in the temple. Ahaz set up a false altar in the temple. They were considered wicked men. Also, they burned their children. That didn't help either. Now, I realize 2 Chronicles 33 talks about Manasseh's repentance and about how he regretted what he had done and returned to the Lord. Kings doesn't mention that. So, if you're bumbling around in heaven and you bump into Manasseh, only the people who didn't read Chronicles will be surprised by that. That's the way it goes. But Manasseh was also, in Kings, Manasseh has nothing good said about him at all. In fact, he is the one who is almost single-handedly blamed for the fall of Judah. He filled Jerusalem with innocent blood from one end to the other, and the Lord would not forgive. And there's a couple of other things to note. So all these different kings, they're unified by this, what good they do for the temple. Joash gets a positive evaluation because he helped fix the temple, even though he does some bad stuff later in his life. The same thing can be said similarly for some of these other guys. Hezekiah and Josiah, though, go a little bit above and beyond in one way. Throughout the whole book of Kings, there's a reference to something called the high places. The high places were basically these elevated locations where people could go and sacrifice. Now sometimes high places were used to sacrifice to idols. Sometimes they were used to sacrifice to the Lord. Now they have high places in India actually as well. They would just altars to everything. But in Judah, sometimes the qualification is made, the people still sacrificed on the high places, but only to the Lord. Did the Lord want people sacrificing on the high places to Him? No, He did not. And so there's only two kings in the whole book that are said to get rid of the high places. Hezekiah and Josiah. They're the only two kings about whom this is said. Solomon sacrifices on the high places his whole reign. You see that in 1 Kings 3 onwards. So Hezekiah and Josiah do something that Solomon never does. They remove the high places and say, it is only at this altar in Jerusalem that you shall worship. It's actually the basis for the crisis that goes on whenever in 2 Kings 18 and 19. Sennacherib comes to attack the city of Jerusalem, and he kind of taunts them and says, your God's not going to save you. Hezekiah just removed all of his high places. Sennacherib didn't understand that the Lord wanted the high places removed. He didn't understand that the high places were a bad thing. And when he blasphemed the God of heaven, the Lord destroyed his army in retaliation. All right, but what happens eventually is from 2 Kings 18 onward, you have Assyria has destroyed Israel. They try to take Judah, and they fail because the Lord defeats them. And then, whenever it's time to go to... but Hezekiah has a son who does so much wickedness and reigns for so long, reigns longer than any other king in the entire history of their nation, more than half a century under one guy. He manages to completely destroy any chance of return that this nation has. And even Josiah, who was a good king, was not able to save them. Josiah's sons, and in one case a grandson, they try to hold on to the throne for a little bit, but they get caught in the middle between a conflict between Egypt and Babylon. And eventually Babylon comes to the city of Jerusalem and destroys the temple and carries them off into captivity as well. Now the Babylonian captivity was different from the Assyrian captivity. Because with Assyria, they were kind of scattered everywhere. With Babylon, they were still kind of able to maintain their cohesive identity. A portion of them were able to return from captivity after 70 years had passed. But the book of Kings doesn't end there. The book of Kings simply ends with them in captivity in Babylon. And with one final note about Josiah's grandson Jehoiachin being released from prison, which is basically the author's way of saying that the Davidic line actually isn't dead yet, guys. It's still functioning, even though he's not on the throne. All right, so we got all that. There's one other thing that really gets central focus in the book of Kings, and I've already kind of alluded to it a little bit. We look at the reign of Solomon. What is the key accomplishment of Solomon's reign? Building the temple, exactly. The story of Kings is in some ways the story of the temple. Because at the beginning of Kings, it's built. And at the end of Kings, what happens? It gets destroyed. The story is about the kings of Israel and Judah, but it's also about the temple. And about what happens to it. About how some people treat it. The folks in Israel didn't treat the temple very well. Hence their wickedness. Folks in Judah, well, they treated the temple well sometimes. But there's something that happens almost every time Judah is invaded by an opposing army. What is almost the first thing the king always does? Plunders what? He plunders the temple. He takes gold out of the temple to pay off the invading army. This keeps happening throughout the book. Hezekiah even does it at one point. He takes gold out of the temple to pay off. Sometimes gold is put into the temple, like with Joash or Josiah. But a lot of times stuff keeps getting taken out. Shishak of Egypt invades, takes all the golden shields. Rehoboam has to replace them with bronze shields. Takes gold from the temple. All these different guys taking gold from the temple. Well, eventually they stop taking gold from the temple and they just take the temple. There's a lesson there about compromise, I think. About just what are we willing to trade in order to appease the world? Well, in this case, you can only do that for so long before the whole thing falls. All right, so that's kind of the outline of Kings in a nutshell. I'm going to pause here for a minute. I know we've gone over this quite a bit. And some of this we're not going to be able to cover because, again, the scope of our study is mainly 1 Kings. I'm going to stop and ask, are there any questions or comments up to this point? Okay. All right, well, there's a couple of other things to note. Let's step back even further. This is an outline of Kings. Kings is actually not existing in a vacuum either. Because Kings is basically a continuation of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which were also one book. In the Septuagint, the 4 books together are called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rangs. And in a way, they're all about kings. We talk about the united kingdom, the divided kingdom. We could simply talk about, the kingdom of Israel and how it did and did not fare. I left my marker over here. All right? But if we were to come up with a way to talk about what happens over the course of Samuel and Kings together, The real story, I think, is the rise and fall of Israel's monarchy. Because you begin at 1 Samuel. What happened, the beginning of 1 Samuel, does Israel have a king? No, they have no king. Right? Well, of course, they go along for a little bit, and then they say, give us a king. And so they get a king, but what kind of king is he? Is he a good king or a bad king? He's not a great king, he's a bad king. Right? And you read a little further into the story, and eventually they get a good king. And that good king is David. David is the ideal king. All other kings are compared to him. Right? And that's the end of Samuel. That's the story of 1 and 2 Samuel in a nutshell. You get into 1 Kings, and we start with the ideal king. The ideal king is Solomon. And then what happens? Well, we have a bunch more bad kings, don't we? The kingdom divides, and there's a lot of different kings, most of whom are less than ideal. A few good ones mixed in there. Just like maybe Saul did a couple of good things in his life. There's a couple of good kings in the mix. And eventually, they get to no king at all. The Lord takes them and their king, whom they appointed, and sends them off into captivity, just like was foretold in the curses in the book of Deuteronomy. That's the story of Samuel Kings in a nutshell. The rise and fall of Israel's monarchy. But in the middle of all of this is a promise that God made. That promise we looked at when we studied 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 7. And what was the promise that God made? Speak up, please. He doesn't talk about captivity in 2 Samuel 7. What does he say to David?
There will always be a son.
Right, exactly. The Lord was going to establish His throne forever. Does that look like forever to you? By itself?
Not by itself.
Not by itself it doesn't, no. Because at the end of the story there's no king. I mean, partway through the story there's a divided kingdom. And so one raises the question, this is the same question that's raised a lot of times in the Bible, is God faithful to His promises? This is a big story of the Scripture being told in a nutshell here. It's the same question they wrestle with in Genesis. Is God faithful? Now you look at this. There's a couple things you got to notice. First of all, if you look at Israel's side of the coin, they go through a lot of dynasties. And I purposefully put a thicker black bar between each of every time they start a new dynasty, just to kind of convey the idea of how often that happens. You look at Judah, Judah's interrupted once by Athaliah. But the kings of Judah are all descendants of David. The Lord did not allow the throne of David to perish. And here's the real kicker. The end of Kings indicates that God did not even allow the throne of David did not allow the descendants of David to perish even while they were in captivity. It came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that Ewil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiakim changed his prison clothes, had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life, and for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day all the days of his life. Is that promise in 2 Samuel 7 dead? No. The Lord is faithful to His promises. Now, what does all this mean? Well, the Lord had something bigger in mind after all. If you look at this in a vacuum, it doesn't look like the descendants of David stayed on the throne forever. But this isn't in a vacuum, is it? How does this story really end?
David does rule on the throne, all mankind is blessed by him.
There you go. David had a descendant of all these good and bad kings on Judah's side, who eventually took the throne of David in heaven. And who, although he suffered, he was the temple of God in his body. And he was the King of Kings. And he fulfills everything that this book is talking about, more and more.
Ever notice the story of the Bible ends with God in control?
Mm-hmm.
Then God loses that quote. Okay? Doesn't look good. Looks like all is lost. All is done. It's over. But in the end, God becomes the story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think of every story that's ever been written by man, every movie that's ever been made, and all of that, Star Wars trilogy being one, how's the story go? The same way. God keeps life.
Right. There's one other thing, and before we close today, and it's in the title we put on this workbook, According to the Word of the Lord. You know, I mean, if our main message here is that throughout the whole book, there's this implicit hint that God actually keeps His Word. And He always keeps His Word. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, they do this more than any other book I've seen in the Old Testament. They will frequently point out an event, and then they'll say, and this happened to fulfill the word of the Lord in regards to such and such and such and such. And they do it, you know, at the oddest of places. For example, whenever Solomon removes Abiathar from being priest in 1 Kings chapter 2, it says in verse 27 that this was to fulfill the word of the Lord which he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. And you just kind of go, well, wait, when did we read about that? You got to go all the way back to 1 Samuel to find out when someone said that. At another point, in 1 Kings chapter 16, in verse 34, in the days of Ahab, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son Segub. But why are his children dying as he sets up Jericho? Verse 34 answers that question, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. That was a long time ago. That was back in Joshua 6. You know, nobody remembers what happened back in Joshua 6, but the Lord does. And the Lord keeps His word. And there's quite a few examples of this throughout the book of Kings. This emphasis on the word of the Lord gets fulfilled. It doesn't matter how long it takes, it will get fulfilled. Because unlike mankind, the Lord has an infinite memory. He remembers everything He's ever said, and He will keep His word. What does that say about the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7? It says quite a bit. We're out of time. We're going to pick up with 1 Kings chapter 1 next time, and I hope that this study will be encouraging and edifying to all of you. And I thank you all for your participation.